In the last few days, the Israel-Palestine conflict has turned into a full-blown confrontation leading to large-scale fatalities. The two sides have an extended history of violence. Violence that began in East Jerusalem in April has expanded to military attacks from both Israel and Palestine. Large-scale injuries and fatalities have been reported. Clashes have broken out between Palestinian Arabs and Jewish groups in Israel. In this episode of the Ceasefire show, we will learn about how it all started and what's the current situation.
Hi. I am Muhammad. Do you guys know about Israel and Palestine conflict? Let's go and ask Dad. Hi Dad, can you please tell me, what is happening between Israel and Palestine these days?
It's a long story, child. I am seeing this as a kid from the year 1978. But yes, I remember my dad means your grandfather told me how this all started. It was the before Christ era, when Israelite King Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem for Jewish people. It remains the holiest site for them. Those were times of empire building, and Jerusalem was invaded by Egyptian and later Roman campaigners who attacked that temple. In 70 BC, Romans destroyed a reconstructed temple built at the Jerusalem site. Jewish people fled in large numbers during these centuries. But they didn't stop here. After this, during the 7th century, Islamic Caliphate army took control of Jerusalem. Flight of the Jewish people continued for centuries. Europe, particularly in and around Germany, had the most important population of Jews. Then in the 19th century, Zionism was launched with an appeal for the return of Jews to Israel or Palestine. After World War I, defeat of Germany saw the increase of Hitler, who blamed Jews for the country's defeat. He expanded Germany and Jews were persecuted in areas he controlled within the post-war settlement. Britain was given the mandate for Palestine and Transjordan, areas including Israel, West Bank and Gaza. Jewish immigration to Israel gained pace. Post-World War II, 1939 to 1945. With the support from the US, and therefore the UK, Jews created the State of Israel in 1948. The declaration came after Jews did not sign an agreement with Arabs for carving out a separate state from Palestine. During 1948, First Israel-Arab War began after Britain's mandate ended, and it lifted its control. Arab countries sided with Palestine, but the war ended with Israel, backed by the US, controlling a large area for its nation. Estimated 700,000 Palestinians lost their homes and have become refugees. In 1956, when the Second Israel-Arab War began, after Egypt announced nationalization of the Suez Canal, a crucial trade route, Israel invaded Egypt, got support from Britain and France. The US and erstwhile USSR brokered a deal to finish the war. In 1964, Palestinians organized themselves under the Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO) for struggle against Israel. Then in 1967, Six-Day War happened, during which Israel defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Israel took control of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Sinai, the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem, the world from which the latest series of violence began. More than 250,000 Palestinians were displaced. What your grandfather told me was that in 1973, Arab nations formed a coalition to attack Israel. It suffered losses but recovered after receiving supplies from the US. The war led to a massive oil crisis. And since 1978, what I am seeing is also horror. That year the US brokered a peace deal between Israel and Egypt. Settling the question of Palestine was a part of the deal that came to be referred to as Camp David Accords. It was never implemented. During 1987, where First Palestinian Intifada was launched. Intifada means uprising or rebellion. Protests and clashes continued for years in Gaza, the West Bank and inside Israel. Many people died and scores were injured during the Intifada. 1991, when Israel begins peace talks with Palestinian leaders, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan in Spain Madrid Conference. But the first major breakthrough was achieved in 1993, where Israel and the PLO signed what's called the Oslo Peace Accord. It was backed by the United Nations. After this there were a number of deals, like in 1994, a follow-up deal was signed, called the Cairo Agreement between Israel and the PLO. The agreements created the Palestinian Authority, which was given the charge of administrative affairs within the West Bank and Gaza. Question of Israeli settlements within the West Bank and the standing of Jerusalem remained unresolved. Both Israel and Palestine view Jerusalem as their future capital. But in 1995, a scenario happened where Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated and Palestinian Authority was blamed. After few years in 2000, Second Palestinian Intifada was launched. Clashes erupted after Israeli hardliner Ariel Sharon visited the compound that houses both the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa, the location of current violence. In 2002, Palestinian militant group Hamas launched first major suicide attack killing a minimum of 30 Israelis. Later in 2006, Hamas won election in Gaza emerging as a political challenger to Fatah, party that was moderate and had won within the West Bank. In the year 2008, Palestinian militants fired rockets into Israel, which was responded by the pummeling missiles into the Palestinian territory. Quite 1,100 Palestinians lost their lives and 13 Israeli soldiers were killed. During the year 2012, another round of rockets was fired between Israel and Palestine. Israel killed Hamas's military chief in an attack. In 2014, a 7-week fight ensued after Hamas allegedly kidnapped 3 Israeli girls from a Jewish settlement within the West Bank and killed them. Around 2,000 Palestinians lost their lives. Israel reported 73 deaths including civilian casualties. Post that in 2015, seeking re-election, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that there would be no two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine question. Also, in 2017, Donald Trump's administration of the US recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and announced the shifting of its embassy from Tel Aviv to the present city. The choice saw fresh protests and clashes within the West Bank and Gaza. This became the reason for multiple clashes in 2018 for several months between Palestinian protesters and Israeli security forces. Rocks, bombs, and rockets were exchanged in which many died. An outbreak of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict commenced on 10 May 2021, though disturbances took place earlier and continued until a ceasefire came into effect on 21 May. It was marked by protests and rioting, police riot control, rocket attacks on Israel by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Israeli airstrikes targeting the Gaza Strip. The crisis was triggered on 6 May when Palestinians began protests in East Jerusalem over an anticipated decision of the Supreme Court of Israel on the eviction of 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. Under international law, the area, effectively annexed by Israel, is a part of the Palestinian territories that Israel currently holds under belligerent occupation. Israel applies its laws there. On the afternoon of 10 May, Hamas gave Israel an ultimatum to withdraw security forces from the Temple Mount complex in Sheikh Jarrah by 6 p.m., or otherwise there would be consequences. When the ultimatum expired without a response, both Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched rockets. Israel began a campaign of airstrikes against Gaza. By 16 May, some 950 targeted attacks had demolished, completely or partially, 18 buildings including 4 high-rise towers, 40 schools, and 4 hospitals, and also struck the Al-Shadi refugee. In addition, at least 19 medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed by Israeli bombardment. As a result of the violence, at least 254 Palestinians including 66 children were killed. In Israel, 13 people were killed, including 1 child. The Gaza Ministry of Health reported that more than 1,900 Palestinians were injured, and as of 12 May Israel reported at least 200 injured Israelis. As of 20 May Israel and Hamas agreed to cease hostilities. A ceasefire deal brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United Nations between Israel and Hamas was enacted at around 2 a.m. on 21 May 2021, ending 11 days of fighting. The final proposal by Egypt was voted on by the Israeli cabinet and was unanimously approved, and Hamas also indicated their acceptance of the peace deal. Other than a minor skirmish at Al-Aqsa Mosque, there were no substantive violations of the ceasefire throughout the day on 21 May. While both sides have agreed to the ceasefire deal, continuous threats by Hamas and stubborn opinion of the Israeli government, peace seems far away. Any future peace deal would require solving very complex issues by both sides.